Then he took work here at the quarries. He also built many granite foundations and steps in homes in Lanesville and Annisquam, which still stand. He lost a finger and became deaf from the dynamite, but he had a very sweet disposition. My mother told me that in the early days, my grandparents had been involved in the Temperance Society in Lanesville, and I was trying to remember the name of the building, and was it called Pythian Hall back then, I wonder? No?
Alan Tidd's place, probably.
Okay. Okay, the Temperance Society, and there were strict rules in her home and their home that there would be no liquor. There on Woodbury Street, they raised the Johnson family. Some here may have known some of them. My mother, Sima, who became Grace. Ellen became Jilka. Albert Johnson, George Johnson. Hillia became Burton, and then Laurie Johnson. They were bilingual and eventually settled in Lanesville, except for Ellen, who went all the way away to Pigeon Cove. My Jilka cousins were the only ones who were taught Finnish as the second language, and that was too bad that the rest of us weren't. Also in Lanesville, my grandfather had a brother, Charlie. He and his wife, Esther, lived on Leverett Street. She was famous for her chocolate cakes. And another brother, Gus, on Washington Street. My grandmother Johnson's younger brother, Matt, or Matti, had also come to Lanesville, but he had believed some of the Russian promises that he heard in the gatherings in Lanesville about a better life in Russia. He and his wife did go to Russia, and my grandmother was very, very sad that they were never heard from again. And they feared that they had been put on a train to Siberia. My father, Joe Grace, served in the U.S. Coast Guard. He was stationed on a cutter out of Gloucester. He met my mother, Sima. They married and bought the house next door to my Johnson grandparents on Woodbury Street, where our family grew up. I was born in that house, literally, with Dr. Baker, who came to the house. My mother was first a wife and mother, and also a very good cook. She sewed, she gardened, she painted. She was involved with the Episcopal Church in Gloucester and made friends there. She had a very strong faith and was very close to her sisters and brothers. Alan Stoll was one of her very good friends. My uncles, who served in the military, George Johnson in Texas, also Laurie Johnson, who was a combat engineer and was part of the horror of the Normandy invasion and Battle of the Bulge, which left a lifelong impact on him. And my brothers, Joe Grace and Albie Grace, and Everett Jilka Jr. also served. Many of us remember when World War II ended in 1945, the bells ringing from the Congregational Church down in Lanesville from where we were. My grandmother practically ran up to our house in joy. She, my mother, and I stood in the yard listening to those bells. Even as a 7-year-old, I felt the impact of what those bells meant. So moving on, one of our neighbors were the Demetriuses, George, Ginny, Aris, and Mike. They raised sheep, and George would give their wool to my grandmother. She carded it and spun it into yarn on her spinning wheel, and we granddaughters learned to knit with that natural wool yarn from the Demetrius sheep. As many did then, my grandmother had a big cast iron stove in the kitchen. Oh, the wonders that came out of that stove. Of course, nisu or pulad must. Cinnamon buns with icing, donuts tossed in sugar, regalepa, the round rye with the hole. And at my grandmother's house, the world stopped for morning and afternoon coffee, along with her baked goods. She had a little bowl of lump sugar and would sip the coffee from the saucer when it was too hot. That was the tradition. So my two brothers, Joe and Albie Grace, had already started school when I was born in 1938. So I was really not a big part of their everyday life. At 6 years old, I went to Lane School, and like others, was lucky to have the new teacher, Mrs. Pistema, in first and second grade. I was the only kid in the Folly Cove area, and as my brothers did, I walked the mile each way to school along Washington Street, all seasons. That's the way it was. I did that walk through 5th grade, and we had Mrs. Smith, was it, that you mentioned? Yes, Virginia Smith, who was wonderful. But the boiler blew at Lanes Cove. Hallelujah, I got on the bus with the rest of us, and I didn't have to walk anymore. Riverdale, Rick School, yes. In the 40s, Ed, when you mentioned the trucks, and we had all of those trucks you mentioned, and also more. We had, and my grandmother also had the beautiful oak icebox still. Let's see, Vegetable Man, we had that. But we had a man that came with a rack of house dresses and aprons. He would pull this rack out of the vehicle, and my grandmother and my mother would come and look. With the others we also had, so I won't go through all of those. But, of course, the Cushman bakery truck. If my grandmother wanted the driver to stop, there was a card that you put in the window facing the street, and so the driver would stop, and he would bring in a tray of goodies. And I remember the delicious lemon-filled buns. In the early 40s, the Great Depression continued to affect the workplace. My father was desperate for work, and he took a WPA summer job in Rye, New Hampshire. We stayed in a small rented cottage close to Wallace Sands Beach, and the crew of men dug drainage ditches in the marshes for mosquito control. He was glad to have the work. He is a carpenter and eventually involved himself in the local carpenters union, and then is the head of the union locally, and then regionally. He was part of the carpentry crew that worked on the API at Andrew Bridge, and I remember the great civic pride in that big bridge. That union involvement led him to become a representative for the Retail Clerks International Association. He was a union organizer throughout the Northeast and Canada, visiting retail stores that wanted to unionize. He had a very strong sense of justice and believed workers should have a voice. As I was growing up, my brothers Joey and Albie Grace, that were 7 and 8 years older and were already out there and busy with Boy Scouts, Cappy Dunn in his Jeep regularly zipped up our driveway to pick them up, jammed in for another adventure. There was one very serious fire in Dogtown area, and it was threatening Woodbury Street. Cappy came barreling up the driveway to pick up my brothers along with other scouts, and my father followed to help fight the fire during the night, and they helped to get it out. Cappy was surely a legend. As my father grew closer to retirement, he served on the city council and then as mayor. At that time, as an accomplished carpenter, he also worked at the Fisk Organ Company in West Gloucester, building beautiful wood pipes for the organs. And he developed a close relation with Charlie Fisk, who I find was a very amazing person. I had cousins of different ages, the Jilkas in Pigeon Cove, Irene, Evelyn, Everett, Edwin, and Elaine, and in Lanesville, Diane Johnson on Woodbury Street, Doug, Dwayne, and Denise Johnson on Washington Street, and Sandy and Richie Burton, also on the other end of Washington Street. In the summer, my Pigeon Cove cousins and I spent many magic days at Folly Cove Beach.